Hello again. You're listening to the Blockchain Socialist Podcast, and we have another episode where we are going to continue overthrowing the network states. And I have here with me the High Priestess of Blockchaingov, Primavera, and our guest, Nathan Schneider, who is now a two-timer on the podcast. This is your second time, so welcome back. Nathan is an academic and researcher who focuses a lot on cooperatives and has also dipped quite a bit of research actually into blockchain, into DAOs, and how they kind of intersect with cooperatives in various ways. And I know you've done quite a bit of work on governance and things like this. So we thought it would be really interesting to talk to you about network states and sort of the lack of governance, I think, that network states actually have. But to start, since I know you're based in Colorado, and so you're at right now the ETH Denver conference that's happening, would you want to maybe describe what it's how you've had or how your experience has been, and maybe how you've seen it evolve over the years to today?
Yeah, thank you. It's so good to be back, and it's awesome to see ETH Denver evolve actually, and I don't always have that same kind of enthusiasm for like crypto conferences, and it certainly has its kind of dangers and flaws and demons. But one thing that's really powerful about it is that, you know, pretty early on, John Poller, who's kind of the orchestrator of the whole thing, made, I think, a very powerful decision to develop the conference as a cooperative DAO, incorporated a DAO as a cooperative. It's called Spork DAO, the underlying entity, and spork like a fork/spoon. And this year, a couple things are really exciting about that. One is Poller has identified this year the theme is the year of the spork, and has really made a point of emphasizing that sense of co-ownership of this conference. And so I think that's a very powerful educational opportunity to show people what it can mean to co-own and co-govern something in the real world, something that is like a point of convergence for a community, and to invite participants in that profound way. Second, that is really neat about it is that the location changed. It really outgrew last year its previous location, which was really interesting, like old kind of Gothic building in Denver. They moved it to the National Western Complex, which is where the big Denver stock shows are, where you come and see cows. And so like I've only ever been there for the stock show to like take my kid to see the fiddle contests, you know.
Are you a cow buyer?
I'm not a cow buyer, but I'm a fiddle aficionado. So it's really actually moving to see this old legacy of agricultural economy, much of which in the Western United States has been organized on cooperative basis. The Farm Bureau and its like cooperative insurance programs, have been historically based at that location too. So to see this like agricultural tradition, this legacy of agricultural co-ownership and co-governance, especially emerging out of that populist movement in the 1880s and beyond, converge with this very, very new form of co-ownership and co-governance. Now, it doesn't mean that it's like kumbaya and all the problems are solved. And there's, just as like that earlier form of cooperativism was always intertwined with colonialism and imperialism, this current form of cooperativism is constantly, hanging in the balance between regens and degens, between the urges of capital control and accumulation and consolidation, or this vision of a more inclusive, more empowering digital economy. So, the struggles are familiar, but it's been very cool to see this, to see this conference kind of be at least a space of opportunity for expanding the cooperative commonwealth, as they used to say.
Right. How does one become a member of the cooperative then?
When you participate, basically, you can receive Spork tokens, and then you, in addition to claiming those tokens, can become register as a member of the cooperative, and in that way, you use like quote unquote real names and that sort of thing, because it's a legal, it's a legal association, not just an on-chain association. But it also enables further forms of economic participation and participation in governance, because that legal entity is kind of deeply tied to the on-chain entity.
Interesting. That is interesting that you talk about governance, because now I would really like to hear kind of your, I guess, initial thoughts on the concept of network states. One of the things that I guess just strike me in relation to like a lot of the work that I've read of you is, of course, kind of the network states obsession with exit, and kind of like I feel like the underlying logic is exit over voice, or don't worry about voice. As long as you can exit, it's fine. But yeah, I'm curious what your thoughts are.
So when the network state idea first started spreading around, actually, I have to say I was really excited by it. At least the idea of trying to shake up what the nation state is, and to create a kind of political entity that better fits our increasingly networked lives. And further, I am no friend of borders and cops and militaries, and I've spent a lot of my like early part of my career was devoted around like logic of nonviolence and anti-war movements, and so the idea that that we could find a way to do away with this nation state, and to enable people to connect more freely across like these bizarre territorial borders we've established, and to reflect our kind of shared network belonging, to produce political affiliations that are native to the networks that we inhabit. All of that is very appealing to me, and also the possibility of experimenting more with how we do political life. How we organize, and so much of that I think resonates also with ideas that were forming in like the late 90s and early 2000s around the counter-globalization movement. And these ideas have long histories in internationalist politics and so forth, around trying to create these networked entities where the whole idea of like counter-globalization is, yes, we want a global identity too. We want globalization too, but through people and movements and shared affinity, rather than through capital flows. And so that initial vision of like, okay, let's replace these territorial entities, or even not replace, but add to that the entities that we might have in our territorial lives, to also have political formations in our in our networked lives. And I actually think like political internationalism has been really missing. When you compare, for instance, left political movements today to what they looked like 100 years ago, there was much more, I think, of a sense of global solidarity and interconnectedness, in a sense that workers of the world unite was a kind of classic slogan that you don't hear anymore. It's much more of workers of this country or that country do something and change policy, right? And so that globalism, that internationalism, really appealed to me. But there are some big
But yeah, I think that's the I think what you kind of described is what I think a lot of people who initially see the network state concept kind of wants to believe it to be. But yeah, I guess after, and it was something that I was hoping it would be, to be honest. But after reading the book, it leans more into actually globalization in the flows of capital, in the sense that it is very reliant on the flow of capital, I guess. At least my understanding and reading of the network states.
I was struck most when I read it, and I think it's a fascinating book. In many respects, it actually reminded me of the Communist Manifesto. As a piece of rhetoric. It's playful, it's forceful, it's weird, and there's an intensity and a kind of also emotional intensity combined with a kind of forcefulness of argument and clarity of argument that I every time he mentioned Marx, I thought, wow, you really sound more like Marx than you realize. But I was struck most of all by what was not there, what was missing, what was unspoken, and that's where I think the most profound concerns lie, and what in particular, I'm concerned is not addressed in any explicit way, and thus will be, when there's a power vacuum and you don't say something, what that usually means is you're inheriting the power structure of the surround. You're enabling what surrounds you to fill the void, and what's missing there is, how are you going to finance this? What is the economic pathway? How are these single founders going to build the polities of their dreams? There's some intimations there around that use kind of token magic, but I think there's a lot of reason to suspect there's a much more to the story than Balaji lets on. And then second, the question of governance. These are the things I'm always obsessed with: ownership and governance. And so when I don't see them, I get worried, because I, if we're not going to make the question of governance explicit, then what are we going to get? We're going to get the forms of ownership and governance that are probably most familiar to Balaji and others in the tech world, which is venture capital and startups and monopoly pursuing ambitious founders who claim to be transforming the world, and in the process consolidate power for themselves and their friends. And so what I end up reading in the absences is this is a proposal to remake politics in the image of a tech startup. And I think there are a lot of reasons to be very, very worried about that trajectory.
And Nathan, just something like before we delve into this question of ownership and governance, one thing I'm actually curious on your perspective, because you said it at the beginning, is like to step away from the state. So I'm curious as well as like, do you see like in the description of the network state, this particular aspect of the network state as not just a mechanism for global political cohesion or coordination, or some kind of like movement by tribal connection or things like this. Like there is also this component that that talks about actually stepping away from the state, and that's an additional layer, which is because we can have a global political movements in ways that you are creating additional layers of coordination and potentially collective management of resources and so forth, including collective management of land, but that doesn't require this stepping away from the state, but rather coexisting with the state, with not by being another state, but by being another entity that somehow coexist, interface, interact with the state and with many other entities that we're creating. And so when you're talking about like the thing that you resonate with and the thing that you do not resonate with, where does this concept of like statehood lies in the context of, do you think that it is an interesting flavor to explore the possibility of like stepping away, or do you think it's actually a potential drawback or maybe it depends on the implementation?
Yeah, I think there's something kind of incoherent, and I think he makes an interesting set of arguments about this. But there's, I think, a lingering incoherence about the idea um, of holding territory, for these network states, and somehow departing from territorial states into this other form. I think it still matters. Like the management of territorial lands, is still something that probably should be done in some kind of cohesive way. And I guess I imagine networked entities as a layer on top of territorial administration, rather than a total departure from. And I say this like coming from, I belong to a network state that happens to be 2,000 years old. I'm a Roman Catholic. We've been at this for a while, and even like Vatican City, has relative autonomy, but it is still deeply enmeshed in its relationship to Italy, and it has diplomatic recognition and all things Balaji wants. But come on, like we're the largest landowner, private landowner in the world, we're still kind of recognize the sovereignty of the territories that these lands are held in. And so it's, I think it's much more useful to think about it as a layer. And what I'm interested in too is how do you create how do you create such layers that we lean less on the state. So for instance, I've written an article on this, for Kernel magazine, called "Lighten the Load of the Nation State." I actually think one of our deep problems in politics today is that we are asking too much of nation states. We're asking them to solve, wealth inequality, climate change, this whole list of things that actually they're very poorly equipped to address because they're global problems, they're networked problems, and territorial nation states are just like don't have the power, even very powerful ones, to directly address those single-handedly. They need to be coordinated solutions, and so I guess my hope is not that these states would just disappear or be supplanted, but that they would be in some ways less important, in the same way that like um, my city has a government, but we don't like have cops at our borders, checking who comes in. We just like that border doesn't matter that much anymore, because like there's other borders matter more, or other kind of lines are more significant. In the same way that like Europe has gone from a bunch of really, really locked up countries to a place where people can flow relatively easily. We've just shifted the focus of what we attend to, and I think that's kind of the opportunity we have to broaden the range of shared concern and the range of shared identity and shared polity, so that we lean less on the nation state. And I think ultimately a vision too here is one um, that that decolonial scholars have talked about as non-exclusive sovereignties. The idea that right now we live in a world in which like which state you belong to is like absolutely critical, and that is a super important identity for you, whether you like it or not. But if you look at, for instance, this beautiful website nativelands.ca, a map of indigenous territories. You look at place where I live in northern Colorado. We've got the Ute, we've got the Cheyenne, we've got the Arapaho territories, all overlapping. The land was, not it was shared among different communities, and we can also imagine people, having multiple sovereignties, multiple relationships to sovereign entities, to political structures, rather than generally just having one. And I think that's actually a freer world in which we can flow more, through networks rather than simply being trapped inside the boundaries of a particular country. So again, there's a lot in that kind of outlook that resonates with what Balaji is saying, and this goes back so much, like with every like shiny new startup, like with Uber, there is that legitimate like longing for more freedom in how we do work, and like the convenience of being able to like order something conveniently on your phone, the ability to like decide when you work and when you don't. Like that is a beautiful and honest and human longing. The problem with Uber is that it's on the terms of a startup that is trying to dominate the world and oppress its workers. And I think we have the same problem. We have this glimpse, this co-optation of a very beautiful set of possibilities for human beings. But there's, it's the catch, that I'm concerned about.
Yeah, it's very interesting because, in fact, like going back to the question of exit, to some extent, like we might question whether an exit-based approach is actually an approach that leads to the highest degree of freedom and liberty, because you actually have to choose between one or the other. And if you don't like one thing in one, then you have to exit the whole thing to get to another network state that maybe is like actually much worse on many other aspects. And all of a sudden, like you're always into this dichotomy, but that you have to pick one, as opposed to what you're describing, which is more like the actual maximum freedom of choice is not the possibility of exit, is the possibility of overlapping, being part of multiple things at the same time and picking the one that abide to your different needs and creating a little constellation of those things in order to fine-tune your citizenship to a variety of communities that you resonate more or less with. And the more choice you have, like choosing one shouldn't prevent you from also choosing another one if you actually want to belong to multiple one, and whatever are the conditions to belong. And so in some way, like there is not just voice, exit, and loyalty, but there is also another one that maybe we need to articulate, which is like inclusion into a multiplicity of overlapping sovereignties and jurisdictions.
Yeah, and I mean, another side that is missing in that exit and voice question, but I think that Albert Hirschman, who proposed this distinction, had in mind with voice was options. What are your choices, and what is structuring those choices? So, for instance, in again, to keep on the topic of rideshare apps, or what they've become, convenience apps, gig apps. In my town again, over the pandemic, a cooperative restaurant delivery service came up that was co-owned by the restaurants, right? And the drivers loved it because it paid better wages than the other ones. The city loved it because it was local, and it was good for the restaurants. The restaurants loved it because it wasn't extracting from them. It was basically an at-cost service designed to support them, and they had governance power over it. So, everyone with deep engagement in this company loved it. The problem is the competitors, the Seamless and Uber or whatever, could flood the zone with venture capital and undercut what this fledgling co-op was trying to do, and ended up driving it out of business. And so we no longer have that option. So now my exit option, if I do food delivery, is like Uber or Seamless, right? And those are two shitty options. So I'm always interested in, particularly like from my experience with cooperative examples like this, is like, what are the options we don't get to have because of the structure of the market or of the ecosystem or whatever is organizing the options. And so exit is always inadequate if you don't have an option that is actually just. So often we see that where people really don't have, first of all, exit is not a real option because it means it has such high cost for individuals, like losing their networks, their family, their livelihood. leaving even a social media app can be devastating for somebody. So exit can be far more costly than it appears. And furthermore, when you do exit, you might not have a good option. It in so many things in our technological world, like basically have to choose between like which monopoly do you want to hang out with, like which horrible option do you want to choose, and you don't have the option of like a community governed like thing that actually has your interests at heart. And that's what I think the danger is here in the absences of the network state proposal so far, is that we're going to end up with a bunch of really lousy options, and we're going to forget that we could actually have a better way. We could actually have that restaurant-owned cooperative, but we don't get to have nice things because the market is organized against them.
Right. I think this is this is just me probably hammering the same point home, but before we had a conversation with Raymond Craven, he made this point as well, that just there is no interrogation or analysis of capital in the network state, and sort of like its role in geopolitics, its role in like, how it creates options or not. I mean, in the example that you gave, like obviously capital had a huge amount of power in being able to shift what options were available for people to exit or not, and so like if you have, I mean, if you just don't interrogate that, then you're just you're just allowing the status quo of capital kind of to reign as it is. But sort of going off of that, one of the things that's very evident in the framework of network states that you've mentioned already is that it calls for like a very venture capital inspired investment model in order to get land and to run its operations, essentially. I'm not sure if he says it explicitly like venture capital, but it's pretty implicit in the way that it's written. But yeah, I guess what are your thoughts on that? And are there any cooperative alternatives that you think could help those who believe themselves to be more progressive and maybe are interested in network states conceptually, but maybe that hopefully they're listening to this episode and they're starting to second guess that?
Absolutely. I mean, he really does not lay out like the investment strategy. The closest thing, as I recall, and I was really looking for this, was that you might like tokenize the community, and the community would grow through the value of the tokens as they become, traded and circulated and used, right? And this is the kind of old Bitcoin, altcoin dream, right?
He's basically saying like, if you believe in the network state first, then you'll have the token first, and maybe you'll be rich later down the line. Like it's pretty implicit.
Or you show value. I mean, there's some reasonableness to the idea. Okay, like maybe you'll luck out, and like the magic money that you create is gonna start being valuable. And we've seen this happen sometimes in crypto land, where like tokens, for mysterious reasons, become valuable because of some faith that people have in what stands behind it, the founder, the idea, whatever it is. But when you look at the norm in emerging crypto practice, that's actually not what's happening. It can look like what's happening, but what's actually happening in far and away the largest platforms, the OpenSeas, the Uniswaps, the major DeFi protocols, the major, even early Ethereum, everything post Bitcoin, is, and even the growth spurts of Bitcoin, is that you have major institutional investor money entering into the picture, and that is what's supercharging these markets. And that is not because of anything having to do with tokens or tokenomics, but because we live in a capitalist world outside of crypto land, and that's where the money is. Like that's why you rob a bank. That's where the money is. And so where the money is in our like old world is what's driving the power in these networked worlds. And similarly, this is what happens when you have a power vacuum, is that the existing power structures of the world outside of it fill the void. And so you end up with that same old power of capital stepping in. And that's in the absence of a clear alternative financing mechanism, that is precisely what would happen with network states. in the same way that it has happened with every major crypto project. And particularly the fact that this is coming from a venture capitalist. This is how he thinks and how he works. So like one has no reason to expect that he has any concern about that model of growth. But there are very good reasons to be concerned about it, that this is a model of growth based on, achieving monopoly style market power, based on accumulating communities on essentially deceptive terms, giving people free stuff to build network effects in order to capture their value or whatever it is you want to capture, their data, their money, their loyalty, their family relationships, their jobs, take your pick. And this is, I think venture capital, like in a healthy economy, might have some role, but it is, I think, a very, very poor tool for achieving things that we rely on in fundamental ways, because it ultimately means that we're relying on something that does not have our best interests at heart. And one hopes, if one is going to replace, quasi poorly but nominally democratic nation states with something else, that you would achieve something that is more accountable to the people who rely on it. And the language of state implies a relationship of reliance, that it is more accountable to the people who rely on it than what came before. And I'm profoundly concerned about a world in which we have to choose among monopolists to access the basic basic rights of citizenship and the basic protections and the basic the common goods, the public goods that we need, healthcare, public assistance, retirement programs, all these things. That's very scary, and it might work out for some people. And that's where that kind of libertarian exit comes in, but it's profoundly unlikely to work out for most people. Venture capital plays are dependent on producing inequalities, and one can expect that a network state play is going to follow that same pattern.
On that point of between the relationship, I guess, between governance and ownership, it feels like here you're mostly tackling on the question of the VC inspired type of governance. At the same time, when we if we talk about network state as this kind of ownership of land that might or might not declare some kind of autonomy or independence, I think there is already some types of interesting experiment which never even envisioned to use the word network state or even state to begin with, because quite to the opposite, they are actually trying to escape from the state, but not just one state. They are escaping from the state structure or the institution of the state. But I think there is in the cooperative movement, I almost feel like there has been those attempts at creating those kind of exclosures or enclaves or spaces where you don't need to declare autonomy. You just create this membrane around a particular subset of territories and try to operate. You try to exit without really exiting from a political, diplomatic layers, but exiting by creating resiliency inside and by creating interconnection. And I'm thinking in particular of the example of the Cooperativa Integral de Catalunya, which I think is really interesting in terms of it is, to me, resonating with the same underlying concept of we want to exit from this model, which is the state model, because there are many things we dislike, but we also want to exit in order to create a very different model. And it's not about replicating the VC capitalist model, but rather we need to exit in order to be able to experiment with new types of collective ownership, with new types of collective governance, and actually promote the common good as opposed to private interest. And somehow the existing structure of the state is preventing us from fully experimenting with that. And so exit becomes whether it's an exit radical declaration of independence or exit by actually trying to protect by creating this kind of like systems that try to interface as little as possible with the state and try to prevent the state from coming inside. And I'm curious, like, so are we talking about something so different? Or this concept of like exit or enclave is actually something that also resonate quite strongly, or at least with some parts of the cooperative movement? And could we imagine a network state type thing that instead of being inspired from like one VC technocratic founder will actually be driven by a communal desire of experimenting with those new type of ownership and governance?
Hi everyone, if you're enjoying this episode so far, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, share with a friend, and join the crypto leftist communities on Discord or Reddit, which you can find links to in the show notes. If you're enjoying the episode or find the content I make important, you can pitch into my efforts starting at $3 a month on patreon.com/theblockchainsocialist to help me out and join the newest patrons like Lara and Fernanda. Supporting really helps since making this stuff isn't free in terms of money or time. As a patron, you'll get a shout out on an episode like I just did and access to bonus content like Q&A episodes where you can submit and vote on questions you'd like me to answer, and I'll give my thoughts in roughly 20 minutes. In the last bonus episode, I analyzed applying an anti-capture framework made for DAOs, but applying it towards left-wing organizing and the specific challenges that they face. Of course, I'll still be making free content like this interview to help spread the message that blockchain doesn't need to be used to further entrench capitalist exploitation, like as described in the network state, if we put our efforts into it. So if that message resonates with you, I hope you'll consider helping out.
Yeah, I appreciate you bringing up the Catalan Integral Cooperative. This is this network in the Barcelona area. I reported on it years ago, and I remember one very important moment for me there was I was just kind of chatting with the kind of administrative folks who were sitting on computers, like doing spreadsheets or something. And I asked them, so like, can you explain to me like what your legal structure is? Like what kind of cooperative are you? And, Catalonia has like a long cooperative history and has lots of interesting cooperative statutes. And they're like, which one? And I said, what? Well, you're a cooperative, right? The cooperative. And they're like, oh no, we have many, many legal entities. And I wasn't sure. I'm not sure any of them were actually cooperatives. And it was striking because they had essentially, it was a very powerful learning for me, because they had done what actually capitalists do all the time, which is like they had their own entity, in their minds, in their community, in their social relationships, and they just used whatever legal entities they needed to use to accomplish their goals. Right? They used the legal system opportunistically, but they had their own. What mattered to them was how they self-organized in their own spaces, and that was a very powerful lesson to me. That idea that the goal is not just to like get your thing instantiated in the state, but to create a layer of interface and relationship. Again, I think that is akin to what institutions like the Catholic Church and others have done for a long time, and certainly that cooperatives do. And I think it's really important to have those layers of that layered life. It goes back to the kind of colonialist democratic theory of Alexis de Tocqueville, that like doing civic associations in everyday life, having mini polities in your daily life is actually really important to being able to practice democracy much more broadly. Also, that space of experimentation, I think, is profoundly important. And that, again, was part of what excited me about this idea of network states, is like, yes, we need more spaces of experimentation. In DAOs right now, in crypto land, there's so much more experimentation with governance models than like I see in cooperatives, because cooperatives are kind of saddled to the state that tells you this is how you're supposed to organize and govern. Whereas in DAO land, people aren't really thinking about that as much. And it opens the door to like figuring out new approaches. And that's really exciting. I don't want to lose that. I'm really eager to protect that. It's one reason I think, what you're doing with the koala model law, Primavera, is so important, because it is a way of carving out and protecting space of experimentation for DAOs. This is a law, a strategy for legal recognition that allows DAOs to remain kind of flexible and creative. And historically, I think there are interesting. You could even do that on a territorial basis. Cities like Shenzhen and Shanghai, developed the way they did in China because they had different rules from the places around them. Now, normally, what ends up happening actually is when special territories are carved out by governments like China, it's to make them more capitalist, to make space for unbridled capitalism. What if instead, we were experimenting both at the network level and at territorial levels with more democratic forms of governance? With let's put a city under the power of a random jury for a few years and see how it goes. See what we learn. That's the kind of thing that I think we need to be pushing, and what is and that is actually the vision that is actually exciting about a network state. Yes, let's have spaces where people can try different things, and we can learn from those experiments, and we can live by them, and we can opt in and opt out to the ones that excite us. And yes, absolutely, let's do that. And it's kind of shocking in the book the degree to which he is very interested in the keto diet network state, which is cool. I'm all about weird lifestyles. I'm really into monasteries, right? Another space of carving out another kind of political life among people who are obsessed with weird things. I am all about that. And who have weird dietary practices. Yes, I want to live in a community of people who also have weird dietary practices. Let's do it. But what's missing is that question of how are you gonna self-govern? And actually, in those monasteries, despite their profound monarchism, often they would still have a modicum in the rule of Saint Benedict of your dictatorial abbot is still elected by the monks every once in a while, or the nuns. In the Middle Ages, Saint Clare, when forming the women's order of the Franciscans, insisted over the objections of the Pope that all the nuns should be heard about big decisions. That this was in some respects going to be a democratic space. And so even by the very modest yardstick of medieval Catholic monasteries, Balaji's governance imagination is impoverished, and that's saying a lot.
No, yeah, it's also the usual discussion of we need those new spaces of experimentation, and the blockchain is this wonderful new space in which you can experiment with all types of governance DAOs and whatnot, and then the metaverse is this whole new space in which we can also experiment. And the problem is it's a fantastic space of experimentation, and just the digital in general is amazing for that. And I think we can, and essentially I think blockchain is interesting because it provides a new space of experimentation, which also involve economics and capital, and therefore increase the degree of collective management that is required in terms of figuring out governance. But the problem though is that if we cannot even imagine to transpose any of those experiments in governance into a physical space until we have experimented with them in a physical space. And because all those new layers of governance issues that come about that we never need to think about when we're thinking into the metaverse, and who's going to clean what at which point. We don't care about those things when we are in a digital world. And all those experimentation of governance which can operate, that even if they prove to operate properly, which we still need to identify those real novel models. But even if we were to find those new models that correctly apply into the digital world, it's unlikely that pure transposition of those models into the physical will actually work. And therefore, I think there is a need of these new spaces and these new exclosures of experimentation in the physical space. And the problem, though, is that it seems that we currently the focus is on let's experiment on replicating or exacerbating existing model as opposed to real experimentation. And that's where I think the cooperative movement might be the one that we would want to bring and get part of this conversation about network states, because they might be the one that really will use this new conceptual toolkit, because it's mostly a conceptual toolkit before anything else, in order to experiment with territorial-based, common-based governance and ownership as a contrast, like compare and contrast with like the Balaji instantiation and then the cooperative instantiation of the same conceptual model.
Something you're always going to hear, and I in my interactions with Balaji, I think there's this kind of dynamic too, and I think it's a well-meaning, kind of ignorant but well-meaning perspective is saying okay, you want to experiment with democracy, that's really nice, like go ahead and do it, let the best model win, right? And so they'll say, yeah, you can experiment, like create your democratic startup. Like I've heard this for years, like working in the cooperative movement, like talking to like, venture-backed founders.
No one's
and all
stopping
these
you. So
yeah, exactly. Like, I'm not going to stop you. I would love to see that happen. Like, yeah, let's have a cooperative alternative to Uber. Great.
But you do that.
Yeah,
I'll be over here doing my
exactly. I'm going to become a billionaire, and that's cool.
You do that cute thing over there. Yeah.
But the and I suspect that will be the response. But the challenge is like we can't actually experiment because the space is organized in such a way that those experiments will never really compete or succeed, and therefore we end up with that option space I was talking about. So we need to be very intentional in exploring these new kinds of political possibilities, in thinking about what kind of infrastructure do we need to actually be able to experiment in the same way that, like, I think crypto is very profound in one important respect, which is that, like, in all previous like online spaces, like the server model has actually just totally inhibited possibilities of self-governance for historical reasons I go into, like in a paper called about this concept of implicit feudalism, and it's been a constrained space, and democratic practice has not emerged for specific reasons, and that kind of practice is emerging in crypto land for specific reasons because of the design of these networks, that they lend themselves in different ways to self-governance and to joint decision making. And so when we think about what kind of infrastructure would we want, say we want network states, okay, but we want democratic network or network somethings. What kind of infrastructure might we want? I would argue that we need like constraints that make sure that like monopolist and monarchist stuff does not emerge, right, and is not encouraged to be successful. And maybe that means like the kind of diplomatic recognition or whatever that they're pursuing, like, is not available for dictatorial regimes. That's one approach. That's a kind of stick approach. The carrot approach could be to say, okay, if we're going to invest in these things, let's really anticipate the problem and create cooperative investment funds. There's a $130 billion cooperative bank down the road from me here in Denver. And it was designed through federal policy because farmers demanded for a bunch of decades, got really noisy, that we need a means to finance our cooperatives. And so finally, reluctantly, the federal government set up this very constrained set of entities that enabled farmers to access billions and billions of dollars to finance their cooperatives. That is itself a cooperative co-owned by the cooperatives that use it. And so, if we were serious about setting up a democratic future through new kinds of networked entities, we would then have to set up the appropriate kinds of democratic financing mechanisms that would be appropriate to that kind of activity. Venture capital is just structurally non-democratic. It's structurally based on achieving consolidated gains and exits. So that kind of carrot and stick needs to be present if we're serious about building democratic futures in these kinds of spaces.
Yeah, I think that point about tech VC investing lends itself, essentially, I would argue, to just like authoritarianism by tech CEO. And especially if you apply that in the context of a state, then you're basically asking for a privatized state, which there is a long history of privatized states and closely linked to colonialism that I think a lot of crypto people just aren't really aware of. And so I get really frustrated whenever I try to explain it, but or like when because I don't know, just recently I've just seen so many people speak positively about network states who clearly did not read the book, or they have read the book and they just have no conception of, I guess, colonialism or like understanding, like using that lens. But so I've just been like super. I have to like explain 10 different things before I can get to my point. Sometimes when I'm in these situations. But since you're at ETH Denver and presumably you're at Shelling Point as well, there were a lot of references to network states throughout these different talks. And Balaji was a keynote speaker at Shelling Point, which, to be honest, really frustrated me. But yeah, I guess how do you see this, and like what would you tell to these, I guess, people who are ostensibly progressive or believe themselves to be progressive about network states to maybe help them think critically about it?
I think the important part is to really honor like the positive urges there, and I've tried to do that in this conversation. I try to do it myself because I feel those positive urges. I really appreciate a lot of what I think is drawing people into this. I feel it in myself. I want out of the militarized nation state too, and I love that other people feel that way. That's a great starting point. That's a really cool place to begin. And I think we need to really work on asserting positive alternatives that, maybe draw on some of this language, that build on it. And, frankly, I mean, the fact that Balaji, like the main thing I'm concerned about this book, other than like the weird rants that drive me crazy, is that it doesn't actually specify the things I'm most concerned about. And so to me, that's an invitation strategically to say, okay, let's specify those things. Let's enter into this conversation and see what happens if we introduce a constraint against authoritarianism, a constraint against investor control, say nothing can be a network state or whatever badge people want to carry, if it is controlled by investors rather than people who rely on it. One could imagine all kinds of things. My understanding is that there are funds being established, like venture funds being established, actually, to invest in network state related projects. We should demand the creation of democratic financing mechanisms. Ask hard questions about like what are the term sheets look like. Let's establish democratic term sheets that won't inhibit participant control. So I think because that the problem is actually absences, there's space for constructive engagement, and for presenting an alternative. I've been lately really into the history of Vanguard, the mutual fund, which I'm no great fan of index funds and the stock market in general, and all these things. I'm part of a campaign now called that is through a Quaker organization called Quaker Action Team, that is trying to push Vanguard to divest from fossil fuels. But one thing that's very interesting about Vanguard is it was a case where somebody, Jack Bogle, this kind of banker type, got really mad at his fellow bankers essentially, and realized, hey, if I just share the thing I'm creating, share ownership with the people who are investing in it, and make it co-owned by them, we're going to cut out some middlemen, and we're going to create a much more streamlined, much more capital efficient, much more powerful kind of entity, and ends up like totally transforming the financial world, and not nearly enough, but at least undercutting costs and significantly lowering costs for individual participants, by creating a cooperatively owned mechanism. Why are there not more people like him? Because he died with $80 million rather than $80 billion, right? Because our system allows people to get far, far too wealthy, right? But at the beginning of anything, there are opportunities to set the table stakes, to set the terms and the conditions. In the same way that in Colorado here, when we were as the crypto ecosystem was developing, we were able to get that ETH Denver institution, when it was much smaller than it is today, to incorporate as a cooperative. And because of that, we're doing, ETH Denver is now an exercise in cooperative education for tens of thousands of people. And so I think this is a moment where we can take advantage of the newness and the excitement around these ideas by asking some hard questions and saying yes and. If the answer is no, then I think the strategy needs to shift. But I think it's still a moment where there are a lot of people who are excited by this idea, who like anybody, hasn't thought through all the possibilities, and those of us who come with a certain kind of analysis and a certain kind of experience can enter in and say, okay, let's contribute to this excitement, in these sorts of ways. So I'm still in kind of a yes and phase, and I hope that can work. I hope that we can insert some really critical tools into this moment, and whether that involves holding the meme of the network state and just reinventing what it means in some important respects, or introducing a counter meme or whatever it is. I'll let the meme masters handle that, but I'm just I will not be satisfied by anything that is less accountable than our shitty quasi-democracy democratic states. That to me is like, in the same way that I used to say to the Bitcoin people, like, come back when you've got something more accountable than the Federal Reserve. Like, I hate the Federal Reserve too, but y'all haven't caught up to it yet. And similarly with at least the Federal Reserve, like, and the U.S. financial system, like, has to care about full employment, has to care about like employment levels, like that matters, and come back when you care about employment, or whatever it takes to get people the money they need to live. Similarly with network states, let's just keep holding that demand. Like, let's prove to me that what we're talking about here is going to be better than where we started from.
Yeah, it's funny because I actually think that many of the people that are the most upset about the network state are the people that are the most excited about the network state. You know what I mean? It's like the people that had like amazing, like they have been thinking about this forever. They have like this beautiful expectation, and then they're like, what the fuck is being said,
Yeah.
But I think it's interesting because it actually, that frustration, I wouldn't call it anger, but like this kind of disappointment in like, wow, there is like such an opportunity and this is how it's being reduced, is something very powerful to tap into, because this is this energy that can actually create a proper alternative. And to me, this is like, it's almost like a call for action that I think that right now, like the people, like, as you said, you have like venture funds that are collecting money in order to create a network state, but who is really putting the money in? Why would you invest into a network state if there is not a profit-making machine? Is the network state becoming some kind of like private corporation with land, or is it just because you can avoid taxes? Like, there has to be, if there is a VC fund, there has to be a profit-making or a commercial interest in doing that. And at the same time, of course, many people that are not aligned with the VC capitalist model will not be interested in putting money in there. On the other side, is like, why isn't there alternative funds being created that are more cooperative? And especially if we have a narrative, which is a strong narrative, which actually resonates with a large majority of the population that might be disappointed to some extent or another with the current institution of the state, with the current institution of capitalism, and I think that cover quite a large portion of population. Those people will actually be those people that will probably never put the money into the VC fund. They might actually be willing to put some money into the cooperative fund in order to create a cooperative model of a network state that, and to which extent is like, it's kind of like the Wikipedia question is like, to which extent can the cooperative collaborative model compete with the VC funds? Well, if you have a narrative that is resonating with a large portion of the population, then it becomes really hard to compete with the collaborative effort. Right. And if we and then you can actually start seeing we can experiment with the emergence of those common based enclaves. And I don't want to call them network states because I don't resonate with the state aspect of network states, but creating those community of kinship that experiment with new governance, new ownership model at the local and territorial level, interconnected with one another, supporting each other in the cosmolocalism perspective. And then maybe at some point you create something that is actually very powerful because of the collaborative nature, because of the cooperative aspect of it, and that can at least coexist and perhaps support and help the existing states that are not really doing as well as they could, and potentially actually show that, well, if you have to put any effort, maybe, unless you just want to do tax evasion, maybe you should actually invest in this new model, which might be more resonating with the population. But to me, this is a narrative question. It's like, this is a mimetic warfare. How do we create such a strong and clear and well instantiated proposition that will actually, you either need like a few $1 billion investors, or you need a few billion people to be interested in something, right? And depending on the narrative, you might attract a different typology of people. But I wouldn't be surprised if there might be a lot of fundings that actually gets attracted by such a powerful narrative, which is, let's actually experiment with communion and collaboration and networked federated communities, as opposed to trying to recreate the institution of the state that has already failed us, with the addition of the institution of capitalism, which is also failing us.
I mean, I think that kind of like collaborative funding can do important things and introduce like strategic commons. I think of cases like Wikipedia or the Fediverse, where like something comes up from nowhere and establishes this powerful, like purpose-driven infrastructure that others can build on. But I actually think, I love what you said about that, like relationship between the different layers, between the, states and the network. I kind of think of them in my head with terrible academic terms like academic or like network jurisdictions. I agree that the state word is not right, but I actually think that you have to look back to the existing states, if we're going to get the infrastructure we need for the next phase. And in the same way that I'm arguing that, that if under the current trajectory, what we are going to get is venture capital. The reason for that is not just because like of private interests aligning in certain ways. It's because our existing states have emboldened and empowered venture capital. Like in 1979, Congress changed the Prudent Man Rule, which affects how pension funds can invest, and basically opened the floodgates for the largest stores of capital, which are highly regulated, to invest in venture capital. And that's what made venture capital take off. Like, if you look at the people who are rich from tech, like they're nothing compared to pension funds. They need pension funds. They can't do anything without, like venture capital was a joke before the pension funds showed up. And so we need to recognize that we are already supercharging a certain model. And if we want a different model, we're going to have to recognize that the structural conditions need to go in that direction. Cooperatives have achieved massive scale when federal in the U.S. when the federal government has created provisions for them to access large amounts of capital, like for rural electrification in the 1930s and 40s and 50s. And still today, rural electric co-ops can access massive stores of capital because the federal government has established infrastructure that allows them to compete. And similarly, I think honestly, it is going to require this recognition among those who are structuring the economy to say, if we're serious about this stuff and we really want to invest in these new kinds of entities, we're going to have to create infrastructures that support them and that support directing large stores of capital to them. Because right now, I think those certain strategic projects can happen through private initiative, but we have to also really appreciate the way in which the existing tax code, the existing weird little regulations. I'm always looking for those weird little regulations that nobody knows about that are structuring this thing. And we need to be very attentive to those, because those are shaping and constraining the possibilities for the future that we're allowed to imagine.
I think that I'm probably more on the side of trying to come up with a different meme or a new concept to just so that we can reframe the entire conversation, just because I think that network states, the concept has just polluted so much of the framework in which we're even beginning the conversation that I think me, you, and Primavera are all interested in, and why we were maybe at first like optimistic about network states, but have, after reading the book, that has changed. So I'm really hoping that we can find something else that we can inject into the conversation, and that we can sort of begin to shift that conversation away from trying to frame everything around tech VC investments onto statecraft, which essentially equates to a type of dictatorship by capital, I would say. So yeah, I guess, do you guys have any last words before we close out?
Yeah, maybe just one little thing that I want to add is like, I think it's actually I'm completely on board on like trying to create like an alternative memes, and I think the alternative memes is not even an alternative memes. I think it's not even like fighting against the network state, because to me the network state is just its own thing, and I don't even want to fight it. It's more like beyond us, but for me it's because it's not about creating, like, again, for me it's not about statehood. It's about networking and collective agency and collective ownership and collective governance. And I think it's almost like, if a meme needs to be created, I would say it's almost like a movement. It's a movement that invites people to experiment locally. We don't even need to buy territory. There is people already that, have land and housing or rent, whatever. It doesn't matter. But experimenting with those kind of new types of monastery, if you want to call them monastery for the sake of it. But those spaces of experimentation with new governance structure, which can start at a small, very local level, but let's experiment at the community level, and then let's connect those community together. And then we have an archipelagos of communities that need to figure out, their own federated networked systems, and then let's keep building on that. And you don't need to even think about VC fundings or fundings and crowdsourcing territories. This territory are already crowdsourced. People are already living in space, and it's more about interconnecting people by making them realize that they are part of the same movement, by naming the movement. And sometimes there is a performative effect that once you name the movement, that's when the movement comes about, because everyone realized they're part of that movement and thought they didn't know about it. And I think that can be a very powerful bottom-up approach, as opposed to which doesn't need to fight with the network state. You can still have network state as you like, but let's mimetically crowd I don't know what's the right word. It's about using the crowd to bring about this movement, and it should be a decentralized movement, and it should be a bottom-up movement, and we don't need anything but what we already have, which is people and spaces to already experiment with those new form of federated governance structures.
Yeah, out of the podcasts into the DAOs. Let's go.
Yes. And we do have a technical infrastructure to experiment. It's just that somehow DAOs as well have not really been exploited or instrumentalized to their maximum benefits by people that are more in a co-ops and common-based approach.
All right, Nathan, do you have any plugs you want to share or recent articles or resources you would like to point people to?
Yeah, sure. On this point, as I mentioned, an essay in Kernel magazine called Lighten the Load of the Nation State that explores some of these themes. And then, another one from some months back in Noema magazine is about encoding human rights into blockchains. And I think this is actually really relevant in terms of thinking about how we might think of blockchains and protocols more like they are polities, more like they're political spaces, spaces where we obtain rights and obligations and responsibilities. And so I think that's actually very relevant, something we didn't really get into around protocol governance and the relationship to this conversation. And then finally, I've got an article that's up as a draft on my website and under open work called Web3 is the Opportunity That We've Had All Along. And that's kind of a plea for seeing the opportunity of Web3 in light of longer struggles for democratic ownership and governance, and I think that's really relevant. It helps kind of put this context in its place, put this challenge in its place, I hope. But above all, thank you so much for all the work you're doing. I'll also plug your new book coming out soon that I've had a chance to look at, and it's awesome. And I think it's going to be a really useful guide for people who share concerns and sensibilities like the ones we've been talking about, and who are trying to find a way to navigate this this strange new world.
Nice, thanks. I haven't yet announced it, but I need to soon. People who listen to the end then will get a sneak peek on a future announcement that I will eventually make. All right. Thanks so much.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.